The prairie evening stretched wide and heavy, carrying the smell of dust and horse sweat across the dry air. The wagon sat at the edge of a narrow trail, its wheels caked in dried mud from the river crossing earlier that day. The sun had dipped, low painting streaks of amber and red across the horizon, while shadows reached long and sharp across the brittle ground. The little girl, no older than 10, crouched beneath the wagon, clutching the rough wooden axle with trembling fingers. Her dress was torn at the knee, streaked with dirt, and her breaths came quick and shallow. She had been told to hide, told to stay absolutely quiet, and told that no matter what happened, she must not come out. Her father had seen the dust cloud long before the riders appeared. He had known what it meant. Men, armed and hard-eyed, the kind who left nothing but ruin in their wake. There had been no time to run, no time to think, only time to act. With a desperate command, he had lifted his daughter and pushed her beneath the wagon, whispering his final warning. Then he had stood tall, rifle gripped in his calloused hands, as the sound of pounding hooves grew louder with every second. Now the girl pressed herself deeper into the earth, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might give her away. She could hear them, their horses snorting, hooves scraping against stone, and then the metallic clink of spurs as boots hit the ground. Voices followed, deep and coarse, carried by men who had no reason to lower them. They laughed, spat into the dirt, and spoke in a way that made her skin crawl. She could not make out every word, but what she understood was enough to turn her stomach. The wagon creaked as one of the men leaned against it, his weight shifting the wooden frame above her. She dared not move, dared not even breathe too loudly. Dust clung to her throat, and her chest burned as she fought the urge to cough. She thought of her mother, left behind at the homestead, waiting for them to return. She thought of her father's eyes, the way they had flashed with fear and determination when he shoved her beneath this wooden shelter. The voices grew clearer, cutting through the tension of the evening air. The men spoke of spoils, of taking what they pleased, of ensuring no witnesses remained. Their words dripped with menace, each syllable sharpening her dread. She wanted to cover her ears, to block it out, but her hands stayed frozen on the axle, nails digging into the splintered wood. She had to know. She had to hear. Her father's voice broke into the mix, firm and steady. He stood alone against them, demanding they leave, that they turn their horses and ride on. But the men only laughed louder, their amusement echoing like a cruel chorus. The girl could feel the ground shift with their movements, boots crunching on gravel, weapons being adjusted and checked. She could almost see it in her mind. The guns glinting in the fading light, the smirks carved into weathered faces, and her father standing tall despite the odds. Her father's rifle cracked once, loud and sharp, tearing through the evening, like a lightning strike. The girl flinched hard, her hands flying to her ears as the sound rang in her skull. A horse shrieked and stumbled, and the outlaws roared in fury. Then came the answering shots, one after another, echoing like thunder in the open air. The wagon above her shuddered as bullets slammed into the wooden panels, splinters falling like rain around her. She bit down hard on her lip to keep from crying out, tasting the metallic tang of blood. Through the chaos, she could hear the men cursing, shouting at one another, promising pain and death. She heard her father's voice again, but this time it was strained, his words cut off by the sound of another volley. Her entire body shook as she tried to make herself smaller, pressing into the dirt as if the earth itself could swallow her whole and keep her safe. When the shooting stopped, silence pressed heavy over the trail. The girl's chest rose and fell, with rapid gasps, her ears straining for any sound that might tell her what had happened. Then, faint at first, she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the wagon. A shadow fell across the ground in front of her, the outline of a man's, boots dusted with trail dirt. He muttered something she could barely hear. Then another man joined him, their voices low but sharp with suspicion. They were searching. Her heart hammered faster, each beat so loud she feared it would betray her. She kept her body still, though. Her muscles screamed for release, her legs cramping beneath her. She remembered her father's warning, the urgency in his tone, and she clung to it like a lifeline. If she moved, if she made a sound, they would find her. Then one of the men spoke words that froze her blood. He talked of making sure no survivors were left, of checking beneath every rock and wheel. Another chuckled darkly, saying children were easy prey. She felt tears sting her eyes, hot and unrelenting, but she dared not let them fall too loudly onto the dirt. The wagon creaked again as one of them leaned close, peering into the shadows beneath. The girl could see the gleam of a revolver at his side, the dust settling on his boots, and she forced her body to remain utterly motionless. Her lungs burned as she held her breath, her entire world narrowing to the tiny gap between the earth and the wagon's frame. But just as quickly, another voice called out, drawing the men's attention away. Something about the spoils, something about finishing the job with her father. Their boots scraped against the ground as they moved off, their attention shifting to whatever prize they thought awaited them. The girl blinked away tears, relief mixing with dread, knowing that danger had only stepped a few paces away but had not vanished. Above her, the sky dimmed as night settled, the last streaks of sunlight bleeding into the horizon. The trail felt colder now, the wagon a thin shield between her and men who would not hesitate to end her life. She knew she could not stay hidden forever, but she also knew moving too soon would be the end of her. So she remained there, small and silent, heart pounding in the darkness, while the voices of the outlaws drifted back toward her father, and what they said next made her tremble harder than she ever had before. The prairie night thickened, wrapping itself in silence broken only by the low murmur of men's voices and the restless snorts of their horses. Beneath the wagon, the girl pressed her face into the dirt, her breath shallow, her hands clutching the rough wood until her knuckles ached. Every nerve in her body screamed for stillness, but her ears strained to catch every word spilling from the men above. What she heard chilled her blood and left her body trembling harder than the gunfire ever had. The outlaws were not passing strangers. They had not stumbled upon her father by chance. They were hunting. Their voices carried the weight of intent, of plans spoken with the confidence of men who believed they owned whatever they set their sights on. They spoke of land, of how her family's homestead stood on ground rich with promise, water, and shelter. They mocked her father for daring to defend it, laughed at his stubbornness, and swore that before the night ended, no trace of him would remain to lay claim to it again. Her heart thudded so hard she thought they would hear it. She realized then that their quarrel was not only with her father, it was with everything he had built, everything her family held dear. They were not simply robbers. They were men determined to erase lives to clear a path for their own greed. And then, with a cruel casualness, one of them spoke of her. He wondered aloud if a child might be hiding nearby, wondered if the family had left anyone behind who could later claim what they sought to take. Another chuckled in agreement, muttering that children were loose ends best tied off before dawn. Mimi. Words sank into her chest like ice water. She curled herself tighter, pressing her body against the axle as if the wood might somehow cloak her completely. She thought of her mother's smile, her father's stern but loving voice, and the small cabin nestled miles behind them on the homestead. It was not only her father's life in danger, it was hers too. The men had no mercy in their tones, only hunger for control and the thrill of destruction. She listened as they argued about how to finish what they had started. Some wanted to torch the wagon, to burn it as a warning. Others preferred to strip it for supplies and leave the wreckage behind as evidence of their dominance. One voice, darker and steadier than the rest, silenced them with authority. He said the land must be cleared, and that meant no witnesses, no trace of the family who had dared to resist. The girl realized then that this man was their leader, the one whose word was final, the one whose plans would decide her fate. The horses shifted uneasily, their hooves crunching against stones, as if they too felt the weight of his command. The girl fought against a sob rising in her throat, forcing herself to swallow it down until her stomach hurt. She knew if they discovered her now, there would be no escape. She was a child in the presence of wolves, and wolves did not spare the weak. Somewhere beyond the wagon her father stirred. She heard him groan faintly, the sound muffled but unmistakable. Her heart lurched. He was alive. The men heard it too, and laughter rippled among them. They mocked his resilience, taunted the idea of a man clinging to life when death already hovered above him. Their boots scraped as they moved toward him, the leader commanding them to drag his body closer to the wagon. The girl's body went rigid. She did not want to see what they would do, but she could not close her ears to their cruelty. The ground shuddered with the weight of her father's body being hauled across it, his boots scraping against dirt and stone. She bit her lip hard enough to taste blood again, terrified that if she whimpered they would hear her. She wanted to reach out to call his name, but fear pinned her silent. From the shadows beneath the wagon, she could see the faint outline of his form in the dim starlight. He was battered, weak, but his chest still rose and fell. Hope flickered faintly in her chest, though it fought a losing battle against the suffocating dread pressing in from all sides. The outlaws spoke again, louder now, their words filled with venom. They said her father would serve as a message, a warning to any who might think of resisting them. They spoke of cutting him down in front of the wagon, leaving his body for the vultures, ensuring that when anyone passed this way, they would know who ruled this land. The girl's stomach twisted. They were not content to kill. They wanted to make an example, to stain the trail with fear. Then came the words that made her hands tremble against the earth. One of them asked again about the child, about her. The leader's voice, cold and sure, replied that she would turn up sooner or later. Children always did, and when she did, they would finish the job. Until then, they would leave no corner unchecked. Her heart froze in her chest. She knew they would search again, more carefully this time. She imagined rough hands dragging her from the shadows, imagined their cruel laughter ringing in her ears. He imagined the flash of steel or the crack of a gun ending her story before it had even begun. Tears slid silently down her dirt-streaked cheeks as she pressed herself deeper into the ground. The outlaws set about their grim work, pulling supplies from the wagon, tearing into crates and scattering provisions across the trail. Their boots thudded against the wood above her head, the wagon creaking with each shift of weight. She clenched her teeth, praying the shadows would cloak her completely, praying the night itself would hide her from their eyes. Somewhere in the chaos, a faint sound pierced the night, the distant howl of a coyote, long and mournful. It carried across the plains, momentarily halting the men in their work. One of them muttered something about bad omens, about spirits stirring in the dark. The leader silenced him with a growl, but the girl clung to the sound like a lifeline. To her, it was a sign she was not alone, that the world beyond this nightmare still existed, but the reprieve was brief. The leader ordered the men to make camp to finish the job by dawn. He wanted the land cleared before the sun rose, before any passer-by might chance upon their crime. The girl realized then that she had until morning, until the first rays of sunlight cut across the horizon, to find a way to survive. As the men settled, as fires crackled and the smell of smoke drifted into the night, the girl lay unmoving, beneath the wagon. Her body ached, her stomach growled, but fear anchored her to the earth. She listened to every word, every laugh, every clink of metal and rattle of supplies, knowing that each sound drew her closer to discovery. She did not know yet how she would escape, or if she could, but she knew one thing with certainty. If she survived the night, she would never be the same again. The firelight bled across the prairie, turning the tall grasses into flickering waves of gold and shadow. Smoke drifted lazily upward, carrying with it the scent of charred wood and stolen food. Beneath the wagon, the girl dared not shift her weight, though her limbs screamed with stiffness. Her cheek pressed against the dirt, her small body curled tight as a spring. She listened. Every crackle of the fire, every scrape of boots, every rustle of leather made her flinch. But it was the voices that cut deepest into her. The men spoke as if they owned the night. They sat near the fire, their faces hardened by years of violence, their laughter sharp as knives. They boasted about past raids, about towns brought low, about farmers and travelers who had dared resist, and paid the price. The girl listened with a hollow stomach as they told of cabins burned to ash, of families scattered, of men left for dead, and women left to mourn in silence. The world beyond her wagon was not a world of law or mercy. It was ruled by the will of those strong enough, cruel enough to take what they wanted. But between their stories and cruel laughter, threads of something darker emerged. They spoke of land, not just here, but far across the plains, of a stretch of territory they meant to claim as their own. Her father's homestead was only one piece of it. They saw the soil as fertile, the rivers as lifelines, the woods as cover. They saw families like hers, not as neighbors, but as obstacles. And obstacles, they declared, were meant to be removed. The girl's stomach knotted as she realized the scale of what they planned. This was not a single act of cruelty. It was a campaign, and her father's resistance had been enough to provoke their wrath. She remembered the pride in his eyes as he had built their small cabin, the strength in his hands as he had tilled the land. He had believed the wilderness could be tamed, that a family could carve out a home with hard work and determination. But to these men all of that meant nothing. The leader's voice carried above the others, steady and commanding, the voice of a man used to obedience. He spoke of her father as a warning to others, but then his words shifted. He spoke of her, of the child they believed must be nearby. His tone was colder now, deliberate. A child, he said, would grow into a claimant, a thorn in their side years. Down the road, better to snuff her out now than risk trouble later. The girl's breath caught in her throat, her body trembling so violently she thought the wagon itself might shake. She pressed her palms against the dirt, fighting to steady herself. Every instinct told her to run, to break from the shadows and flee into the night. But the horses were tethered nearby, restless yet watchful, and the men's rifles leaned casually against their knees. She would never make it 10 steps before they caught her. So she lay still, her only weapon silence, her only shield the sliver of darkness beneath the wagon. Her father groaned again from where they had left him, and the sound silenced the men's talk. For a moment, only the fire popped. Then boots, scuffed against the earth as 2 of them rose. They dragged him closer, his body limp, his breath shallow. The girl could see his boots now, dusty and worn, just beyond the rim of the wagon's shadow. Her chest ached as she fought the urge to crawl out, to cling to him, but she knew it would mean both their deaths. The outlaws debated what to do with him. Some favored finishing him quickly, a bullet in the head to silence his defiance. Others wanted to prolong it, to let him suffer until dawn as a lesson. The leader listened, then declared he would live until morning. By sunrise, he said, their message would be carved into the trail itself. The men grunted approval, though not all seemed satisfied. The girl's eyes blurred with tears. Each ragged breath her father took was a torment, yet each was also a fragile thread of hope. As long as he lived, even barely, she could not give up. She had to believe there was a way, though none appeared. The night stretched long before her, and every passing second brought the danger of discovery. The men ate from her family's supplies, tearing open sacks of flour, biting into apples her mother had packed. They mocked the careful hand that had prepared the food, sneering at the idea of honest labor when theft was easier. The girl's fists clenched until her nails bit her palms, her small body quivering with a mixture of terror and rage she had never known before. Time dragged. The stars shifted overhead, and the air grew colder. The firelight danced, casting monstrous shadows across the ground. The girl's muscles cramped, her body numb, but she dared not move. Her ears strained for every sound, and it was then she caught something new. One of the men, restless and suspicious, rose from the fire. He muttered about checking the wagon again, about making sure no one had slipped away into the shadows. Her heart stopped. The scrape of his boots grew louder, each step bringing him closer. She pressed her body flat against the earth, her breath held, her mind screaming silent prayers. The wood above her creaked as he laid a hand against the wagon, circling slowly. She could see his boots now, inches away, the dirt shifting under. His weight. The fire crackled, a horse snorted, and then another voice called him back. The leader barked that the child would be found at dawn, that wasting time in the dark was foolish. The boots hesitated, then turned away. Relief flooded her, but it was fragile, fleeting. She knew they would not stop searching forever. As the man rejoined the others, the girl exhaled silently, her chest heaving. Her whole body shook, not just from fear but from the realization of how close death had been. One wrong move, one louder breath, and her story would have ended in that moment. Yet in her trembling came resolve. She could not wait for dawn. Dawn would bring her discovery, her father's death, the ruin of everything. If she was to survive, if her father was to live, she had to act before the sky lightened. The thought filled her with dread. What could a child do against armed men? But the alternative was certain doom. Her eyes flicked to her father's boots again, still and unmoving. She thought of his strength, of the lessons he had given her about courage, about the land, about never backing down when something worth fighting for was at stake. The fear in her chest did not vanish, but alongside it burned something fiercer. The night was not over, and neither was her chance. The prairie night deepened, the fire sinking into coals that pulsed red like a beating heart. The outlaws grew drowsy, their raucous voices softening into mutters, then into snores. Horses shifted uneasily, stamping their hooves against the hard earth, their breath misting in the cold air. The girl remained motionless beneath the wagon, her body aching from hours of stillness, but her mind churned. Every moment that passed tightened the noose around her and her father. Dawn was coming, and with it discovery and death. Action, however terrifying, was no longer a choice, but a necessity. Slowly she shifted her weight, moving inch by inch until her cramped limbs stretched. She slid her hand across the dirt, steadying herself as she eased toward the wagon's edge. Her small frame made her nearly invisible in the shadows, but the slightest misstep could betray her. She held her breath, listening to the snores of the men, gauging the rhythm of their sleep. When the loudest one gave a guttural snort, she moved, using the sound to mask her shuffle forward. At last, her eyes found her father again. His body was bound with rope, his chest rising and falling shallowly. Blood stained his shirt, dark against the pale light of the stars. The sight nearly undid her. Every instinct screamed to crawl to him, to untie the ropes, to shake him awake. But she knew the futility of it. Even if she freed him, he could not walk, and she could not carry him far before the men roused. She needed something else, something to turn the balance in their favor. Her eyes swept the camp. The rifles leaned against a stump near the fire, too far to reach without waking the men. Knives glinted faintly in belts and boots. A heavy satchel lay nearby, carelessly dropped by one of the men. Closer, tethered to a tree, the horses pawed and shifted. An idea flickered in her mind, desperate and dangerous. If she could not outfight them, perhaps she could outwit them. Her father had always said the land itself could be a weapon if one knew how to use it. She remembered his lessons about fire, about how a spark in dry grass could roar into a blaze. The outlaws had built their fire carelessly, letting sparks dance into the surrounding brush. She could see the tinder waiting, dry stalks bending low to the ground, eager for flame. Her small hands trembled as she crept from the wagon's shadow, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would wake the camp. She moved on bare feet, the earth cold beneath her, each step deliberate. She reached the edge of the fire, crouching low as she scooped a fallen ember with a broken piece of tin. The heat seared her fingers, but she bit back the pain, clutching it close. Step by step she carried the ember toward the brush, shielding it with her body from the men's view. The grass caught quickly, whispering into flame, then crackling into life. The fire spread in crawling fingers, hungry and quiet at first. She darted back into the shadows, her lungs tight with fear. Within moments the blaze grew bolder, flames leaping higher, smoke curling thick. A horse whinnied sharply, jerking at its tether, its hooves striking the ground in panic. The outlaws stirred, muttering in confusion, then shouting as the fire roared to life. They scrambled to their feet, cursing, their boots pounding as they rushed to stamp out the spreading flames. Two of them grabbed blankets, swatting at the blaze. Another ran to calm the horses, his shouts drowned by the animals' cries. The leader barked orders, his voice cutting through the chaos, but the fire was already beyond their control. The girl seized the moment. She darted toward her father, her small hands fumbling at the knots in the rope. The coarse fibers bit into her skin as she pulled, her fingers raw, her breath ragged. Her father stirred faintly, his lips moving soundlessly, but his strength was gone. She worked faster, her eyes darting back to the men. The firelight cast wild shadows, confusion reigniting fear in her chest. At last, one knot gave way, then another. She pulled until his arms slipped free, then worked at the ropes around his legs. The flames crackled louder, the smoke thickening, and for a moment it seemed the fire might consume them all. Her father's bonds fell away, and she pressed her hands to his shoulder, urging him weakly toward the wagon. He tried to rise, but his strength faltered, his body collapsing against hers. She choked back a sob, her small frame straining under his weight. The horses screamed again, one breaking free of its tether, charging into the darkness. The outlaws shouted in pursuit, distracted by the chaos. The girl seized the distraction, half dragging, half pushing her father toward the wagon. She pulled him beneath its frame, shielding him in the shadows where she had hidden herself. His breath rattled in his chest, but his eyes fluttered open briefly, just enough to meet hers with a glimmer of recognition. She lay beside him, her chest heaving, her body slick with sweat despite the cold. The fire raged now, the men frantic, their voices sharp with anger and desperation. Some tried to beat back the flames, others chased after fleeing horses, their unity cracking under the pressure. The leader shouted again, but even his voice carried a note of doubt. The girl clung to her father's hand, her mind racing. The fire had bought them time, but not freedom. Eventually, the outlaws would return to the camp, furious and determined. They would search again, and this time they would not be careless. She had disrupted their night, but the dawn still threatened. Her eyes flicked toward the rifles near the fire. If she could take one, she might stand a chance. But the thought of holding such a weapon, of aiming it at men twice her size, filled her with dread. Yet she also remembered the sound of their voices, cold and merciless as they spoke of killing her. Fear and courage warred in her chest, twisting her insides. The night stretched on, the fire casting eerie light across the prairie. The outlaws battled against it, their shouts echoing, their silhouettes jerking against the flames. And under the wagon the girl lay with her father, her mind sharpened by desperation, her heart pounding with resolve. She had taken her first step into defiance, and though danger still loomed, she knew she could not stop now. Somewhere beyond the chaos, the horizon began to pale with the faintest hint of dawn. Dawn crept slowly across the prairie, painting the horizon with thin strokes of pale gold and grey. The fire, once wild and consuming, had burned itself into blackened earth and curling smoke. Ash drifted in the breeze, settling like dust on the men's boots and faces as they stood among the wreckage of their night. The outlaws were weary, their tempers sharp, their movements jerky with exhaustion. They had lost horses, supplies, and control. But what they had not lost was their hunger to finish what they had started. Under the wagon, the girl pressed close to her father, who shivered against the chill despite the heat that still clung to the scorched ground. His eyes opened and closed, in fitful flickers, his breath shallow and uneven. She could see the toll of his wounds, the blood that still seeped slowly from the torn flesh at his side. She brushed her hand against his, silently promising she would not leave him. Above them, boots crunched against the soil, voices sharp and bitter. The men were arguing now, blaming one another, accusing, cursing the fire and its destruction. The leader's voice rose above the rest, steady and venomous. He swore that whoever had caused the blaze would pay, and his suspicion grew like a storm cloud. He barked orders to search the camp, every corner, every shadow, no stone left unturned. The girl's stomach dropped as the men scattered, kicking through ashes, lifting canvas, overturning barrels. Their steps drew closer, the air thick with the certainty of discovery. Her heart pounded in her ears, each thud louder than the last. She clutched her father's hand tighter, bracing for the inevitable. A boot slammed against the wagon wheel, shaking the frame above her. The man cursed, then bent low, his shadow falling across the ground. For one terrifying moment, the girl's eyes met the dull glint of his belt buckle, so near she could almost reach out and touch it. His hand lowered, sweeping the dirt as if to search beneath. Then, in the distance, another outlaw shouted. His voice carried urgency, claiming he had found something. The man at the wagon hesitated, grunted, and straightened. His footsteps retreated, his attention pulled away. The girl exhaled a breath she did not know she had been holding, her body trembling with relief and fear intertwined. But she knew their reprieve would not last. Once the men realized there was nothing of value in the direction of the shout, they would return. They would not stop until they uncovered every secret the camp concealed. She had minutes, perhaps less, to decide what must be done. Her eyes returned to the rifles leaning near the fire pit, blackened by soot, but still deadly. She hated the thought of touching one, but the memory of their voices, calm, cruel, certain as they planned to kill her, hardened her resolve. She released her father's hand, whispering a silent promise that she would come back, then crawled from beneath the wagon. Her body moved low to the ground, her limbs light with adrenaline, her eyes fixed on the prize. The men were distracted, their backs turned, their voices raised in dispute. She reached the stump where the weapons rested, her fingers trembling. As they closed around the rough wood of a rifle's stock, it was heavier than she expected, awkward in her small hands, but she clung to it as though it were a lifeline. For a moment, she froze. The weapon was foreign, terrible, and the thought of using it sickened her, yet she remembered the words of the leader, the cold certainty of death in his voice, and she knew choice was an illusion. She lifted the rifle and scrambled back beneath the wagon, her breath ragged, her arms straining under the weight. Her father stirred weakly, his eyes flicking to the weapon, a faint spark of understanding in his gaze before exhaustion claimed him again. The girl steadied herself, trying to mimic the way she had once seen her father hold a hunting gun. She braced the rifle against her shoulder, though it nearly slipped from her grip, the wood biting into her small frame. She pointed it toward the edge of the camp, where the men were beginning to circle back, their search narrowing again. They returned, in twos and threes, their faces grim, their anger sharp. The leader was the first to approach the wagon once more, his eyes narrowed, suspicion burning. He barked at another man to lift the wagon and check beneath. The girl's heart leapt into her throat, but she did not falter. She pressed the butt of the rifle harder against her shoulder, her finger trembling on the trigger. The outlaw bent low, his hands reaching for the frame. In that moment, the girl squeezed her eyes shut and pulled. The rifle thundered, the recoil slamming against her body, nearly knocking her backward. The shot tore through the air, echoing across the open land. Screams followed, shouts of alarm, confusion, rage. One man fell, clutching his leg, writhing in the dirt. The others scattered, some drawing their own weapons, others diving for cover. The girl's hands shook violently, the rifle nearly slipping from her grasp, but she held on. Smoke curled from the barrel, the scent of gunpowder filling her nose. The leader's voice rang out again, furious, demanding to know who had fired. His eyes swept the camp, and then realization struck him. He bared his teeth in a grim smile, pointing toward the wagon, declaring he had found the culprit. The men closed in, cautious now, rifles raised. The girl pressed herself against her father, her small body shielding his. She knew she could not fight them all, but she also knew she could not surrender. Her mind raced, searching for anything, any way to tip the scales once more. And then salvation came not by her hands, but by fate's. In the distance, a whistle pierced the air, sharp, distinct, unmistakable. The sound of mounted men followed, the thunder of hooves rolling across the earth. Dust rose on the horizon as riders approached, fast and steady. The outlaws froze, their eyes darting toward the growing cloud. Fear flickered across their faces, fear they tried to mask with anger. The girl clutched the rifle tighter, hope sparking in her chest. Whoever was coming, friend or foe, they would break the stranglehold of this moment. The outlaws exchanged hurried words, their formation faltering. The leader cursed loudly, demanding his men stand their ground, but hesitation had already taken root. As the riders drew closer, sunlight struck their badges, glinting bright and unmistakable. Lawmen. The girl's heart leapt, tears burning her eyes. The outlaws shouted, panicked now, scrambling for horses they no longer had. The leader spat his final curse, vowing vengeance before vanishing into the smoke with a handful of men at his heels. The rest scattered like leaves in the wind, trampled under the weight of fear. Moments later, the lawmen rode into the ruined camp, rifles drawn, eyes sharp. The girl remained beneath the wagon, clinging to her father, the rifle still trembling in her hands. When one of the riders dismounted, his voice steady and kind, she allowed herself to believe at last that the nightmare was ending. The dawn had broken, and with it, her world had changed. She had entered the night as a hidden child trembling beneath a wagon, but she emerged from it as something else entirely, scarred, burdened, but unbroken. The prairie wind carried away the smoke, leaving only silence, sunlight, and the promise of survival.